The autumn morning carried an unusual tension through the corridors of Windsor Castle. King Charles III stood by the tall windows of his private study, watching the golden leaves dance in the crisp October wind. His hands, weathered by age and responsibility, gripped a letter that had arrived earlier that morning. The royal seal bore the mark of urgency, and its contents would soon shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Prince William approached his father's study with measured steps. The heir to the throne had noticed the subtle changes in palace protocol over recent weeks. Staff members whispered in hushed tones, and his stepmother Camilla had become increasingly distant during family gatherings. Something was brewing beneath the polished surface of royal life, and William sensed it was connected to secrets that had been carefully guarded for years. The king turned as his son entered the room. Charles's face showed the weight of his years and the burden of recent discoveries. Without a word, he extended his hand toward William. This simple gesture, which would later be captured by a hidden photographer and scrutinized by media worldwide, carried more significance than either man initially realized. The touch between father and son represented a moment of unity before a storm that would challenge everything the royal family had worked to protect. Camilla, the queen consort, had spent the morning in her private apartments, pacing nervously between her sitting room and bedroom. She clutched her mobile phone, repeatedly checking for messages from her personal secretary. The carefully constructed narrative she had maintained for over 2 decades was beginning to crumble. Phone records, financial documents, and witness statements were surfacing, threatening to expose decisions she had made during her early years with Charles, choices that could permanently damage the monarchy's reputation. The secret that Camilla had fought so desperately to conceal involved more than personal embarrassment. During the tumultuous period following Princess Diana's death in 1997, when public sentiment against her was at its peak, Camilla had authorized a comprehensive media manipulation campaign. Working with a network of journalists, publicists, and even members of parliament, she had systematically planted stories to rehabilitate her image while simultaneously undermining potential rivals within the royal circle. These efforts went far beyond typical public relations work. Camilla's team had hired private investigators to gather compromising information about Diana's friends and supporters. They had paid substantial sums to tabloid editors to suppress negative stories about her while ensuring that unflattering coverage of other royal family members continued. Most damaging of all, they had interfered with charitable organizations that Diana had supported, redirecting donations and sabotaging events that might have honored the late princess's memory. William had begun to suspect something was amiss when he noticed irregularities in the financial reports of several charities his mother had championed. The prince had always maintained a close oversight of these organizations, considering them part of his mother's enduring legacy. When donation patterns suddenly shifted and several long-term board members resigned without explanation, William launched his own quiet investigation. Working with a small team of trusted advisors, William had spent months following paper trails and interviewing former palace staff members. What he discovered painted a picture of systematic deception that stretched back nearly 3 decades. Camilla's campaign to secure her position had not only damaged Diana's posthumous reputation but had also diverted millions of pounds that should have gone to vulnerable children and families. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Bank records showed payments from accounts linked to Camilla's private holdings to media organizations and private investigation firms. Email correspondence revealed detailed strategies for manipulating public perception. Most shocking of all were recorded conversations between Camilla and her advisors, discussing specific plans to undermine charitable work associated with Diana's name. Charles had learned about his son's investigation only days earlier when William presented him with a comprehensive dossier of evidence. The king found himself caught between his loyalty to his wife and his duty to the crown. The revelations threatened not only Camilla's position but also Charles's own reign, as questions would inevitably arise about his knowledge and complicity in these activities. The morning meeting between Charles and William was intended to discuss how to handle the explosive information. Both men understood that the evidence would eventually become public, either through William's investigation or through the journalists who were already beginning to ask pointed questions. The challenge was determining how to protect the monarchy while ensuring that justice was served. Camilla's attempts to suppress the investigation had grown increasingly desperate. She had contacted several media moguls, calling in favors accumulated over decades of careful relationship building. She had even approached certain government officials, suggesting that the stability of the monarchy was at stake. However, her efforts were proving futile as more evidence surfaced each day. The queen consort's private conversations with her closest confidants revealed her growing panic. She spoke of feeling trapped by decisions she had made decades earlier, choices that had seemed necessary at the time, but now appeared calculated and cruel. Camilla expressed particular concern about public reaction, knowing that any revelation of her role in undermining Diana's charitable work would be seen as the ultimate betrayal. Meanwhile, William struggled with his own emotions as he processed the full scope of Camilla's deception. The prince had always maintained a cordial relationship with his stepmother, understanding that his father's happiness was important for the family's stability. However, learning that Camilla had actively worked to damage his mother's legacy created a deep sense of personal betrayal that went beyond political considerations. The palace staff had begun to notice the tension among the senior royals. Meetings were held behind closed doors, and the usual informal interactions between family members had become strained. Several long-serving employees reported unusual activity, including late-night sessions in the king's private office and an increased security presence around certain areas of the castle. Public relations experts within the royal household were quietly developing contingency plans for various scenarios. They understood that the story, whatever its ultimate form, would dominate headlines for months and potentially reshape public perception of the monarchy. The challenge was crafting a response that would satisfy demands for accountability while preserving the institution's fundamental credibility. As the morning progressed, Charles and William found themselves discussing not just the immediate crisis, but also broader questions about the monarchy's future. The scandal threatened to undermine years of careful work to modernize the institution and make it more relevant to contemporary British society. Both men recognized that their response to this challenge would define their reigns and potentially determine the monarchy's survival. The letter that Charles held contained the latest update from the legal team handling the investigation. New evidence had emerged overnight, including testimony from a former palace press secretary who had detailed knowledge of Camilla's activities. The witness was prepared to speak publicly, making it impossible to contain the story much longer. Camilla's final attempt at damage control involved a personal appeal to Charles, asking him to use his influence to suppress the investigation. She argued that the monarchy could not survive another major scandal so soon after various other controversies. However, both Charles and William understood that covering up the truth would only make the eventual revelation more damaging and potentially criminal. The moment when Charles took William's hand represented more than a simple gesture of support. It symbolized a recognition that they faced this crisis together, as father and son united in their commitment to the crown's integrity. Neither man could have predicted that this private moment of solidarity would soon become public knowledge, setting in motion a series of events that would forever change the British monarchy. As afternoon approached, the three principal figures in this unfolding drama prepared for what they knew would be a defining confrontation. Charles armed himself with the evidence his son had compiled. William steeled himself for a conversation that would reshape his family relationships, and Camilla made final preparations for a defense of her actions that few would find convincing. The stage was set for revelations that would shock the nation and force a reckoning with secrets that had shaped the royal family for over 2 decades. The truth, so carefully hidden and fiercely protected, was finally ready to emerge into the harsh light of public scrutiny. The confrontation took place in the Blue Drawing Room at Windsor Castle, a space that had witnessed countless family discussions throughout British history. Camilla entered the ornate chamber with her head held high, but her trembling hands betrayed the nervousness she fought to conceal. Charles and William sat across from her, the compiled evidence spread across an antique mahogany table like pieces of a damning puzzle. William began the conversation with measured words, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil beneath the surface. He outlined each piece of evidence methodically, allowing Camilla to respond to every accusation. The recorded conversations were particularly devastating, as they captured her voice discussing strategies to undermine charitable organizations that meant everything to Diana's supporters and, more importantly, to the beneficiaries who depended on those resources. Camilla's initial response was denial, followed by attempts to justify her actions as necessary protection for the monarchy's stability. She argued that the period following Diana's death had created unprecedented challenges for the institution, requiring extraordinary measures to preserve public confidence in the crown. However, As William presented bank records showing payments to private investigators and media manipulation specialists, her defensive stance began to crumble. The most damaging revelation involved a children's hospital project that Diana had personally championed in her final years. Camilla's team had systematically undermined fundraising efforts for this facility, redirecting potential donors toward causes that would enhance her own reputation. The hospital's construction had been delayed by nearly 5 years, during which time dozens of seriously ill children had been forced to seek treatment in inadequate facilities or travel hundreds of miles to access appropriate care. Charles listened in growing horror as his son detailed the human cost of his wife's campaign. Medical records, carefully anonymized but powerfully illustrative, showed how the delayed hospital construction had affected treatment outcomes for vulnerable young patients. Some families had faced financial ruin traveling for medical care that should have been available locally. Others had endured prolonged suffering while waiting for procedures that could have been performed years earlier. Camilla's attempts to minimize her responsibility grew increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted. She claimed that her advisors had acted without her knowledge, that financial transactions had been misrepresented, and that recordings had been taken out of context. However, the documentation was too comprehensive and the witness testimony too detailed for these explanations to carry credibility. The conversation took a particularly emotional turn when William confronted Camilla about her interference with Diana's memorial projects. Several initiatives designed to honor his mother's charitable work had been quietly sabotaged through Camilla's network of contacts. Planning committees had been infiltrated, funding sources had been discouraged, and key supporters had been subjected to negative publicity campaigns designed to undermine their credibility. One especially painful example involved a scholarship program for disadvantaged young people that Diana had envisioned before her death. William had worked for years to bring this project to fruition, only to encounter mysterious obstacles at every turn. Applications disappeared, funding sources withdrew without explanation, and partner organizations suddenly developed concerns about the program's viability. Now he understood that these setbacks had been deliberately orchestrated by the woman who had become his stepmother. Charles found himself forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that he had failed to protect his late wife's legacy and had unknowingly enabled the very person responsible for undermining it. The king had always prided himself on his commitment to charitable work, yet his closest companion had been systematically destroying the philanthropic initiatives that meant most to his sons and to the memory of their mother. Camilla's final line of defense involved threats about the potential consequences of making these revelations public. She warned that exposing her actions would damage the monarchy beyond repair, particularly given the institution's ongoing efforts to modernize and maintain relevance. She suggested that the scandal would provide ammunition for Republican movements and potentially destabilize the constitutional system that Charles and William were sworn to protect. However, both men recognized that covering up the truth would be far more damaging than confronting it honestly. The evidence was too extensive and involved too many witnesses to remain hidden indefinitely. More importantly, they understood that protecting the monarchy's integrity required accountability, even when that accountability came at great personal cost. The discussion revealed additional layers of Camilla's deception that extended beyond the immediate scandal. She had maintained detailed files on various royal family members, collecting information that could be used to maintain her position or deflect criticism. These files included personal details about William and Harry's private lives, financial information about other royals, and even medical records that had been obtained through questionable means. William discovered that Camilla had been monitoring his own charitable activities for years, looking for vulnerabilities that could be exploited if he ever challenged her position within the family. She had cultivated relationships with key figures in his professional network, positioning herself to influence decisions that should have been entirely within his discretion as the heir to the throne. The revelation that Camilla had interfered with his brother Harry's military service came as a particular shock to William. Sensitive information about Harry's deployments and security arrangements had been shared with media contacts, creating unnecessary risks for both Harry and his fellow service members. While this information had never been published, its existence in unauthorized hands represented a serious breach of operational security that could have had fatal consequences. Charles struggled to reconcile his personal feelings for Camilla with the mounting evidence of her calculated manipulation of his family and the institution he served. The woman he had married was revealed as someone willing to compromise the safety and well-being of his sons to protect her own interests. This realization forced him to question fundamental assumptions about their relationship and her motivations throughout their long association. As the afternoon wore on, Camilla's composure finally broke completely. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the clear disapproval of both Charles and William, she broke down in tears and admitted to the essential facts of the accusations. However, her confession came with continued attempts at justification, claiming that her actions had been motivated by love for Charles and desire to protect the monarchy from Diana's continued influence. This explanation proved particularly offensive to William, who saw it as a final attempt to manipulate the situation by portraying destructive actions as protective measures. The prince made it clear that undermining his mother's charitable legacy could never be justified by claims of institutional protection, especially when the ultimate victims were vulnerable children and families who had depended on those charitable resources. The immediate question facing the three royals was how to address the situation moving forward. William insisted that full accountability was necessary, including public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and efforts to repair the damage caused by Camilla's actions. Charles found himself torn between his duty as king and his feelings as a husband, recognizing that his response would define both his reign and his family's future. Camilla made desperate pleas for forgiveness and opportunities to make amends privately, without public disclosure of her actions. She proposed extensive charitable work and financial contributions to the organizations she had damaged, hoping to avoid the personal and institutional consequences of public exposure. However, both Charles and William understood that private remedies would be insufficient given the scope and duration of her deceptive campaign. The conversation concluded with an agreement that Camilla would have 24 hours to consider her options and propose a path forward. Charles made it clear that continued denial or attempts at cover-up were no longer acceptable, while William emphasized that any solution must prioritize the interests of the charitable organizations and individuals who had been harmed by her actions. As evening fell over Windsor Castle, each of the three participants retreated to consider the implications of the afternoon's revelations. Camilla faced the prospect of public disgrace and possible legal consequences for her actions. Charles contemplated the potential end of his marriage and the challenges of leading the monarchy through another major scandal. William prepared for the difficult task of ensuring justice while protecting the institution he would one day inherit. The next 24 hours would prove crucial in determining not only Camilla's fate, but also the future direction of the British monarchy. The secrets that had been exposed could no longer be hidden, and the response to this crisis would echo through royal history for generations to come. The 24-hour deadline passed without any meaningful response from Camilla, forcing Charles and William to move forward with their own plans. The Queen Consort had spent the night consulting with her personal legal team, exploring options that might allow her to maintain her position while minimizing public exposure of her actions. Her lawyers painted a grim picture of potential consequences, including possible criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy related to the charitable fund diversions. Meanwhile, William worked through the night with his private secretary and a small team of trusted advisors to develop a comprehensive response plan. They identified every charitable organization that had been affected by Camilla's interference, calculated the financial damages, and prepared detailed documentation that would allow for proper restitution. The prince was determined that the victims of his stepmother's campaign would be fully compensated, regardless of the personal or institutional cost. Charles faced perhaps the most difficult decision of his life as he weighed his obligations as monarch against his feelings as a husband. Palace constitutional experts had advised him that Camilla's actions, if proven in court, could constitute a breach of her oath as queen consort to serve the people of the United Kingdom. The king understood that protecting someone who had actively harmed charitable organizations would fundamentally undermine the monarchy's moral authority. The morning brought unexpected developments when several major newspapers received anonymous packages containing key pieces of evidence from the investigation. Someone with access to the royal family's private discussions had decided to force the issue by making the scandal public. Initial reports were carefully worded to avoid legal challenges, but they contained enough detail to make clear that serious accusations were being investigated within the highest levels of the monarchy. Camilla's reaction to the media reports was swift and panicked. She immediately contacted the most powerful media figures in her network, calling in decades of accumulated favors to try to suppress further coverage. However, the evidence was too compelling and the story too significant for even her most loyal supporters to ignore. Several editors who had previously been willing to help her manage negative publicity now distanced themselves from any association with her activities. The public response to the initial reports was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Social media platforms erupted with condemnation of Camilla's actions, particularly regarding her interference with children's charity work. Hashtags calling for her resignation as queen consort began trending worldwide, and demonstrations started forming outside palace gates. The monarchy's approval ratings, which had stabilized somewhat since Charles's coronation, began plummeting as details of the scandal emerged. William found himself in the unprecedented position of having to choose between family loyalty and public duty. His investigation had uncovered the truth, but he now faced criticism for not acting more quickly to expose his stepmother's deception. Some commentators suggested that the prince had been complicit in covering up Camilla's actions, while others praised him for bringing the truth to light despite personal costs. The palace press office struggled to develop an appropriate response to the growing media storm. Traditional strategies of deflection and delay were impossible given the comprehensive nature of the evidence and the involvement of senior royals in the investigation. Press Secretary Maria Thompson found herself crafting statements that neither confirmed nor denied the allegations while buying time for the family to reach a final decision about how to proceed. Behind the scenes, senior government officials were briefing the Prime Minister about the potential constitutional implications of the scandal. The involvement of the Queen Consort in activities that had harmed British charitable organizations raised questions about the monarchy's fitness to serve as a symbol of national values. Cabinet discussions centered on whether government intervention might be necessary to preserve institutional stability. Charles's private meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury proved particularly significant in shaping his ultimate decision. The religious leader reminded the king of his coronation oath to serve God and the people, emphasizing that personal relationships could never take precedence over these sacred commitments. The Archbishop's counsel helped Charles understand that protecting Camilla from accountability would constitute a betrayal of the trust placed in the monarchy by the British people. Camilla made one final attempt to save her position by proposing a comprehensive settlement that would compensate all affected charities while allowing her to remain as queen consort with reduced public duties. She argued that her resignation would create unnecessary instability for the monarchy and suggested that private penance was more appropriate than public disgrace. However, this proposal was rejected by both Charles and William, who recognized that half measures would satisfy no one and would only prolong the crisis. The breakthrough came when additional evidence emerged showing that Camilla's activities had continued much more recently than previously understood. Financial records revealed that she had interfered with charitable fundraising as late as the previous year, undermining organizations working with homeless veterans and disadvantaged children. This recent activity eliminated any possibility of dismissing her actions as ancient history that could be quietly forgiven and forgotten. William's emotional confrontation with his stepmother in the castle's garden room marked the point of no return in their relationship. The prince made clear that he could never forgive her for continuing to damage his mother's charitable legacy even after becoming queen consort. More importantly, he stated that he would actively oppose any attempt to shield her from the consequences of her actions, even if it meant public conflict with his father. The practical implications of the scandal extended far beyond the immediate royal family. Dozens of charitable organizations began reviewing their own experiences with suspicious obstacles and unexplained difficulties, realizing that they too might have been victims of Camilla's interference. Legal firms specializing in charitable law prepared to file suit against various entities involved in the deceptive campaign, creating the potential for years of litigation. Charles's consultation with senior judges about the legal implications of the evidence proved sobering. The Lord Chief Justice explained that the scope and duration of Camilla's activities could constitute serious criminal offenses, including fraud, conspiracy, and potentially even charges related to endangering public welfare through her interference with medical charity funding. The king learned that royal status would provide no protection if prosecutors decided to pursue criminal charges. The international implications of the scandal began to emerge as Commonwealth leaders expressed concern about the monarchy's credibility as head of their constitutional systems. Several Republican movements in Commonwealth countries cited Camilla's actions as evidence that the monarchy was no longer fit to serve as a symbol of shared values and democratic principles. The Governor-General of Australia privately advised Buckingham Palace that the scandal was providing ammunition for renewed Republican campaigns. Camilla's increasingly erratic behavior during this period included attempts to destroy additional evidence and efforts to intimidate potential witnesses. Palace security had to intervene when she tried to access William's private office, apparently seeking information that might help her defense. These actions only reinforced perceptions that she was prioritizing self-preservation over accountability or institutional responsibility. The final straw came when investigators discovered that Camilla had attempted to interfere with the investigation itself by offering financial incentives to potential witnesses to remain silent. This obstruction of justice represented a new level of misconduct that made her position completely untenable. Even her most ardent supporters within the royal household recognized that she had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. Charles's decision to demand Camilla's resignation was communicated to her through formal channels, marking the end of their personal relationship as well as her royal role. The king's statement emphasized that the monarchy must be held to the highest standards of conduct and that no individual, regardless of personal relationships, could be allowed to undermine the institution's integrity. This decision represented one of the most difficult moments of Charles's life, but also demonstrated his commitment to duty over personal comfort. The news of Camilla's impending resignation leaked to the press before any official announcement, creating a media frenzy outside all royal residences. Public reaction was swift and largely supportive of the decision, with many commentators praising Charles for choosing institutional integrity over personal loyalty. However, some observers questioned why the scandal had been allowed to continue for so long and whether adequate safeguards existed to prevent similar situations in the future. As preparations began for Camilla's formal resignation and departure from royal life, William worked with parliamentary leaders to develop new oversight mechanisms that would prevent future abuse of royal positions. The prince recognized that this crisis represented an opportunity to strengthen the monarchy's accountability structures and demonstrate its commitment to transparency and ethical conduct. The stage was now set for the most dramatic resignation in modern royal history, with implications that would reshape the monarchy for generations to come. The formal announcement of Camilla's resignation as queen consort sent shockwaves through the British establishment and beyond. The carefully worded palace statement, released at precisely 11 a.m. on a gray November morning, cited irreconcilable differences regarding charitable responsibilities and constitutional obligations as the reason for her departure from royal duties. The statement avoided explicit details of the scandal but left little doubt about the serious nature of the allegations that had forced this unprecedented action. Within hours of the announcement, Camilla's legal team issued their own statement attempting to frame her resignation as a voluntary decision made in the best interests of the monarchy. They emphasized her decades of public service and suggested that the allegations against her had been exaggerated by political enemies seeking to damage the institution. However, this defensive narrative was quickly overwhelmed by more detailed reporting about the evidence that had forced the king's hand. The immediate aftermath of the resignation saw a coordinated effort by William and his advisors to begin repairing the damage caused by Camilla's actions. The prince personally contacted the leadership of every affected charitable organization, offering formal apologies and guarantees that full restitution would be provided. Many of these conversations were emotionally difficult, as charity leaders described the real-world consequences of delayed projects and diverted funding on the vulnerable populations they served. Charles retreated to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, seeking privacy to process the personal cost of his decision while managing the institutional challenges created by the scandal. The king's private papers from this period, later disclosed in authorized biographies, revealed his profound sense of betrayal and guilt about his failure to detect his wife's deceptive activities. Palace physicians grew concerned about the monarch's mental and physical health as he struggled with the dual burdens of personal loss and constitutional crisis. The public response to Camilla's departure was overwhelmingly positive, with opinion polls showing strong support for Charles's decision to prioritize institutional integrity over personal loyalty. However, the scandal also prompted broader questions about the monarchy's oversight mechanisms and whether sufficient safeguards existed to prevent similar abuses in the future. Parliamentary committees began discussing potential reforms to increase accountability and transparency within the royal household. Media investigations into Camilla's network of contacts revealed the extensive scope of her influence operation. Journalists discovered that her manipulation efforts had extended far beyond charity work to include interference with academic institutions, cultural organizations, and even religious groups that might have honored Diana's memory. The breadth of this campaign suggested a level of systematic deception that shocked even experienced royal watchers. International reactions to the scandal varied significantly across different countries and constitutional systems. Republican movements in Commonwealth nations seized on the crisis as evidence that hereditary monarchy was incompatible with modern democratic values. However, many constitutional monarchies expressed support for Charles's handling of the situation, viewing his decisive action as evidence that the institution could adapt and maintain accountability. Camilla's departure from royal residences was conducted with minimal fanfare, in stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonies that had marked her entry into the royal family. She was permitted to retain certain personal possessions and financial arrangements, but lost access to all royal titles, patronages, and official duties. The symbolic stripping away of her royal status was completed within days, as if the monarchy sought to distance itself as quickly as possible from the scandal she had created. The investigation into the full extent of Camilla's activities continued even after her resignation, as prosecutors evaluated whether criminal charges should be filed. The evidence of financial fraud and conspiracy was substantial, but legal experts debated whether prosecuting a former queen consort would create more problems than it solved. Ultimately, a compromise was reached that focused on civil restitution rather than criminal punishment, though the threat of prosecution remained if Camilla failed to cooperate fully with compensation efforts. William emerged from the crisis with enhanced credibility and public support, as his role in exposing the truth demonstrated his commitment to justice over family loyalty. The prince used this goodwill to launch a comprehensive review of royal charitable activities, establishing new oversight mechanisms and transparency requirements that would prevent future abuse. His leadership during this difficult period was widely seen as preparing him well for his eventual role as king. The process of compensating affected charities proved more complex than initially anticipated, as investigators continued to uncover additional instances of interference and manipulation. The final settlement required the royal household to provide nearly £50 million in compensation, sourced from the crown's private funds rather than public money. This financial commitment sent a clear message that the monarchy was willing to bear significant costs to repair the damage caused by one of its members. Several former palace employees came forward after Camilla's resignation to provide additional testimony about her activities. These witnesses described a culture of intimidation and secrecy that had enabled her deceptive campaign to continue undetected for so long. Their accounts prompted reforms in palace management structure and employee protection policies to ensure that future misconduct could be reported and addressed more quickly. The constitutional implications of the scandal extended beyond the immediate royal family to affect the broader relationship between the monarchy and parliament. Legislative leaders demanded increased oversight of royal activities and more detailed reporting requirements for charitable work conducted under royal patronage. While these reforms were initially resisted by traditionalists, they ultimately strengthened the monarchy by demonstrating its commitment to accountability. Camilla's attempts to rehabilitate her reputation through media appearances and public statements proved largely unsuccessful. Her interviews were widely criticized as self-serving and lacking genuine accountability for the harm she had caused. Public opinion remained firmly against her, and attempts by supportive media figures to generate sympathy for her position failed to gain traction with audiences who remained focused on the victims of her actions. The impact on Charles's personal life was profound and lasting. Palace insiders reported that the king struggled with depression and social withdrawal in the months following his wife's resignation. His public duties continued without interruption, but those close to him described a man fundamentally changed by the betrayal he had experienced. The monarch's trust in others was severely damaged, affecting his relationships with staff, advisors, and even family members. William's relationship with his father grew stronger during this period as they worked together to navigate the crisis and implement reforms. The prince's loyalty and support during Charles's darkest moments created a bond between them that had been absent during earlier periods of their relationship. This partnership became a source of stability for the monarchy as it worked to rebuild public confidence. The long-term consequences for royal security became apparent as investigators realized how Camilla's activities had compromised sensitive information about family members and royal operations. New protocols were implemented to limit access to confidential materials and to monitor unusual activities within royal households. These security measures, while necessary, also contributed to a more formal and restricted atmosphere within palace walls. The scandal's impact on royal staff morale was significant, as many longtime employees felt betrayed by their failure to detect or prevent Camilla's activities. Several senior administrators offered their resignations, taking responsibility for the oversight failures that had enabled the deception to continue. While some of these resignations were accepted, Charles also recognized that completely replacing experienced staff would further destabilize an already shaken institution. Public ceremonies and royal events took on different meanings in the aftermath of the scandal. The absence of Camilla from these occasions served as a constant reminder of the crisis, but also demonstrated the monarchy's commitment to moving forward with integrity. Charles's solo appearances at charitable functions were particularly poignant, as he personally apologized to organizations that had been affected by his former wife's actions. The international diplomatic implications continued to evolve as foreign governments adjusted their relationships with the British monarchy. Some nations expressed increased confidence in the institution following Charles's decisive handling of the crisis, while others remained concerned about the potential for future scandals. The king's state visits during this period required careful advance work to address questions about the monarchy's stability and credibility. As the immediate crisis phase began to wind down, attention turned to the long-term reforms and structural changes that would prevent similar situations in the future. The monarchy faced pressure to modernize its operations while maintaining its traditional character, a balance that proved challenging but ultimately strengthening for the institution. 6 months after Camilla's resignation, the true scope of the transformation within the British monarchy became apparent to both insiders and the general public. The institution that had seemed rigid and tradition-bound proved capable of remarkable adaptation when faced with an existential crisis. Charles, initially devastated by personal betrayal, emerged as a more decisive and reform-minded monarch than anyone had anticipated. The comprehensive charitable review initiated by William yielded stunning results that extended far beyond the immediate scandal. Investigators discovered systematic inefficiencies and gaps in oversight that had persisted for decades, suggesting that Camilla's deception had been enabled by broader structural problems within royal administration. These findings prompted the most extensive modernization of royal operations since the Victorian era. William's new role as the monarchy's chief reformer brought him unprecedented public support and political influence. The prince worked directly with parliamentary leaders to develop legislation that would increase transparency in royal charitable activities while preserving the institution's independence. His ability to bridge traditional royal protocol with modern accountability standards impressed even Republican critics who had previously viewed the monarchy as outdated. The financial restitution process revealed the extraordinary generosity of the Crown's response to the scandal. Beyond the initial £50 million committed to affected charities, Charles personally donated an additional $20 million from his private wealth to establish an endowment, ensuring these organizations would never again face funding uncertainties. This unprecedented gesture demonstrated the king's genuine commitment to repairing the damage caused by his former wife's actions. Camilla's life after her resignation became a study in social isolation and financial difficulty. Stripped of royal support and facing legal bills from multiple civil suits, she was forced to sell her private properties and significantly reduce her lifestyle. Former friends and supporters distanced themselves as the full extent of her deceptive campaign became public knowledge. Her attempts to write a tell-all memoir were thwarted when publishers deemed the legal risks too great. The impact on charitable giving patterns across the United Kingdom proved to be one of the most positive, unexpected consequences of the scandal. Public awareness of the importance of charitable oversight increased dramatically, leading to greater scrutiny of all nonprofit organizations and ultimately improving the entire sector's accountability standards. Donations to the organizations that had been targeted by Camilla's interference reached record levels as supporters rallied to demonstrate their commitment. Charles's personal healing journey became intertwined with his growth as a monarch. Palace physicians and therapists worked with the king to address the psychological trauma of the betrayal while helping him develop new strategies for evaluating trust and making decisions. This process, while initially painful, ultimately made him a more empathetic and effective leader who could connect with subjects who had experienced similar personal betrayals. The constitutional reforms prompted by the scandal established new precedents for royal accountability that were studied and admired by monarchies worldwide. The balance between preserving royal independence and ensuring public oversight became a model for other constitutional systems facing similar challenges. Academic conferences and diplomatic exchanges focused on the Windsor model of crisis management and institutional reform. William's investigation skills, first demonstrated in uncovering his stepmother's deception, were redirected toward positive institutional improvements. The prince established an internal audit system within royal operations that could identify problems before they became crises. This proactive approach to management impressed business leaders and government officials who began seeking William's advice on organizational reform in their own sectors. The media's role in the scandal prompted broader discussions about the relationship between the press and the monarchy. New protocols were established for handling sensitive information while maintaining appropriate transparency. The palace's communication strategy evolved to be more proactive and honest, reducing the likelihood that future problems would be allowed to fester in secrecy. The long-term impact on royal family dynamics extended beyond the immediate crisis participants. Harry, observing his brother's principled handling of the situation from his residence abroad, began privately exploring the possibility of reconciliation and a limited return to royal duties. The crisis had demonstrated that the monarchy could change and that integrity could take precedence over convenience or tradition. Educational institutions began incorporating the scandal and its aftermath into curricula on constitutional law, public administration, and crisis management. The case study offered rich material for analyzing how institutions can respond to internal threats while maintaining public confidence. Business schools particularly focused on Charles's decision-making process as an example of choosing long-term institutional health over short-term personal comfort. The investigation into Camilla's network of contacts yielded ongoing benefits as authorities identified and prosecuted several individuals who had been involved in similar deceptive schemes. The expertise developed during the royal investigation proved valuable in uncovering financial fraud and media manipulation in other contexts, leading to improved law enforcement capabilities in areas of white-collar crime. Public opinion polling conducted 1 year after the scandal showed remarkable results for the monarchy's reputation. Support for the institution reached its highest level in decades, with citizens expressing appreciation for Charles's handling of the crisis and optimism about William's future reign. The scandal, which could have destroyed public confidence, instead demonstrated that the monarchy could be held accountable and could reform itself when necessary. The physical transformation of royal residences reflected the institutional changes taking place within the monarchy. Security systems were upgraded, administrative offices were reorganized for greater efficiency and oversight, and public access was increased to demonstrate transparency. Clarence House, former residence of Charles and Camilla, was converted into a public center for charitable organizations, symbolically transforming a site of scandal into a hub for positive social impact. International diplomatic relationships, initially strained by the scandal, ultimately strengthened as foreign leaders recognized the monarchy's commitment to accountability. State visits during the second year after Camilla's resignation were marked by discussions about governance, transparency, and institutional reform. Charles found himself in the unexpected role of advising other leaders on managing internal crises while maintaining public confidence. The technological innovations implemented during the crisis continued to benefit royal operations long after the immediate problems were resolved. Digital monitoring systems for charitable activities, enhanced communication platforms for staff coordination, and improved record-keeping protocols increased efficiency while providing the transparency that modern publics expected from their institutions. Camilla's complete disappearance from public life after failed attempts at rehabilitation became a powerful symbol of accountability in action. Her absence from royal events, charitable functions, and social gatherings that had once defined her identity served as a constant reminder that actions have consequences, regardless of social status or personal connections. This visible demonstration of justice being served helped maintain public support for the monarchy's reformed approach. The successful conclusion of the crisis established Charles as a monarch capable of making difficult decisions when institutional integrity was at stake. His willingness to sacrifice personal happiness for public duty earned respect across political divides and international boundaries. The king's transformation from a sometimes criticized heir to a decisive and principled monarch became one of the most remarkable personal evolutions in modern royal history. William's preparation for his eventual reign was accelerated and enhanced by his experience managing the crisis. The prince's demonstration of investigative skills, diplomatic capability, and moral courage provided compelling evidence that the monarchy's future was in capable hands. His relationship with the public evolved from respectful distance to genuine partnership in governance reform. As the immediate crisis faded into history, the long-term structural changes it had prompted ensured that the British monarchy emerged stronger, more accountable, and more relevant to contemporary society than it had been in generations. The scandal that could have destroyed the institution instead catalyzed its most successful modernization, creating a template for how traditional institutions could adapt to modern expectations while preserving their essential character and purpose. The story of King Charles taking Prince William's hand became symbolic of more than family unity in a moment of crisis. It represented the passing of responsibility from one generation to the next, the triumph of institutional integrity over personal loyalty, and the monarchy's ability to reform itself when faced with existential challenges. The gesture, captured and scrutinized by the world's media, ultimately came to symbolize the beginning of a new era in British royal history.